Thank you for coming. My name is Donna Cady, and I am Professor of Humanities here at Middlesex Community College, and also the coordinator for the MCC Asian Studies Development Program here and in the region. And this is our spring lecture series, and we are so pleased that we have Nguyen here today to talk about Southeast Asia colonialism, Indochina. But first, before I introduce her and before the talk begins, I'd like to encourage you to all think about coming to several of our other events this spring. One of the first events that we'll be having after this talk today is on February 18th. We'll be having a film screening of Ai Weiwei's Human Flow. It is a stunningly visual film about human migration, and one that is poignant and certainly timely in our global world. The other thing that I hope that you'll consider attending is April 2nd and 3rd. It is an Asian Studies Development workshop, free, lunch included, and that's always a plus, right? And on Thursday, the 2nd, Peter Hershog, who directs the Asian Studies Development Program, will be providing a degree at the University of California, Berkeley in 2019, and is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Kogut Institute for the Humanities with the Department of History at Brown University. Now, she specializes in the history of Vietnam, Southeast Asia, print culture, and libraries, with an upcoming book manuscript titled Reading and Misreading: The Social Life of Libraries and Colonial Control in Vietnam, 1865 to 1958. Now, she teaches courses on Southeast Asia, comparative empires, history of information and classification, and memory and diaspora, print culture, and the history of the book. It is my great pleasure to welcome Cindy Nguyen today. Thank you.
Thank you again so much. It's always so exciting to have someone introduce you. It's just like, what is she talking about? I'm like, I don't know. It feels a little bit like a dissonance. So
surreal, huh?
For that special introduction. And thank you for Anna and Donna for helping to organize and bringing me here. It is such an honor and so special to get the chance to talk with all of you every time. Like, as Donna mentioned, I just got my PhD, and I feel like there was a flirt. I don't even know what was. It was a big rush of finishing everything up. So teaching is an exciting way for me to process what's been happening, why I'm doing what I'm doing, and how I got here. So thank you again for having this space. I'm Professor Nguyen. I am a scholar of specifically modern Vietnam, and today I'm going to talk about Indochina history. Another way of framing this discussion is just to start explaining why it is that I study the colonial period, why it is I study Indochina and Vietnam, and in hopes is that I could also help to spark some ideas and conversation about memory and history, and also school, like why we learn certain things and what draws us to ask questions and keep learning. So first off, why did I start studying about Indochina? Well, I was raised on stories. I was raised on stories from my parents who are Vietnamese and who fled the post-Vietnam War government in 1987 and fled by boat. So in 1987, my family, after many tries of trying to flee during the Vietnam War, and after the fall of Saigon in 1975, my family gathered all their life savings. And at that point, my grandparents had 10 kids, so they could only send so many of their kids abroad or try to leave the country. So they bought a passage on a boat, and my parents, my older sister, who at that time was 4, and my older brother, who was 3, fled in the night, and went by boat illegally, dangerously, and essentially starved in the ocean for 8 days until we were rescued by Malaysian Coastal Guard. And at that time, my mom didn't know that she was actually pregnant with me. So she was 3 months pregnant with me. So I ended up being born in a refugee camp. And I remember her telling me this story. As a kid, you know, just like asking stories, asking your parents, like, where did we come from? How did I get here? Or even things like, and then like kids, you talk to each other, it's like, oh, where were you born? And then you ask, and I'm like, I was born at a refugee camp. And then it became almost like a story that it felt fictive in a way, because it just felt so different than my like suburban realities of growing up in Southern California. We were going to school, and all the kids were talking about Christmas and presents, and going home to their grandparents, and then my grandparents were still in Vietnam, and so it just always became this feeling like I had this part of myself that was both really real, because it happened, it was part of my family's narrative and how we got here, but it also felt so different than my childhood realities and my classmates. So these are just a few photos of me in the camp. I think I could, oh yeah, there's my mouse. So this is actually me here. I'm about 6 months old here. My mom's carrying me. It's my dad, my older sister, my older brother, my uncle. At this point, we were accepted to come to the United States. We were sponsored by our own family members and also a relief organization in America. So then when we got accepted to come from the refugee camp in Malaysia, we got reprocessed in a relocation camp in the Philippines. And you can actually tell here the habitation here is a little bit more developed as opposed to the camps in Malaysia, which are very much like these are sheet metal. It's we're essentially, like my mom would always tell me these stories that living in the camp was like we were treated like animals because we each were allocated a tiny plot of space to live and eat and sleep, all six of us in this tiny space. But by the time we got to the Philippines, it was a little bit more developed. Also, this is a neighborhood kid that was just really mean and bit all of us all the time. So we just like now is in part of our, our little family portrait. And this is a photo. I really like this photo because it just shows how kind of the different communities that were created through the camp. So these are the other neighbors that were in the Filipino relocation camp, and we're celebrating today. And you can tell that we're celebrating because what's this right here? Coke, right? A Coca-Cola bottle. It's like very special. They're celebrating because we were accepted to come to the United States. There's my brother. It's very hot. That's why he's like not wearing a shirt. And there's like me kind of peeping out in the back. But we're all celebrating because we're about to move to the United States. So how does this have to do with how I studied history? I mean, it very much informed how I understood the past, right? I was so much like raised by the past, my parents always talking about the past, and then I was just trying to make sense of what this meant. What was this country that my family fled? What relationship does it have with America? How did we end up here? And how does my family's story fit into that narrative? And for me, like the first thing I did is I was going to K-12 education, and then I would like ask my teachers, or there were a lot of Vietnamese diaspora and refugees in California, and so there would be other students who wanted to like learn more about what happened. But most of the stories and most of the class curriculum was very much focused on the Vietnam War from an American perspective. So it always started in about like 1960s and then ended right in 1975 when the U.S. withdrew from South Vietnam and Saigon fell. And for me, that didn't fit the timeline that I grew up with, just because I was like, I think there's still a country there. I think there's still people. There were people living there from 75 up until my family left, and also living there now. What did that look like, and what was that reality like? I started to try to figure out and understand Vietnam. First thing I did was I went to the library, and then when the internet became more popular, I Googled it. And I want to open this up to discussion, and if you have other questions, please feel free to interrupt me and ask questions. But so if you were to Google Vietnam, what would you see on Google or Google Images? What kind of things would show up? Yeah. Did you like? Oh. Is anyone? You could also Google and see what. Yeah, it's in the back.
Would it be like a jungle type area?
Yeah, it's a little like landscape type, understanding like the tropical landscape. What other images or results might you find if you just Google Vietnam or Vietnam history?
There's like two, right? Two. Separated or something.
Yeah, I think some of the results might be like North Vietnam or
Yeah.
South Vietnam. So officially Vietnam was divided from 1954 to 1975. And then I said in 1975 the US troops withdrew and there was a fall of Saigon. But officially in official communist state histories, it's the reunification of the country. So it's when the North and the South were reunified. So then it bring the country into under one communist nation. So there's still like a lot of division, like even though the country is officially unified, like there's still a lot of division between North and South Vietnam. That's a really good point. What else might you find if you're just searching around? Yeah.
Banana Hills.
Banana Hills,
I
yeah.
saw a picture. I didn't know that was there.
Yeah, what did you see about Banana Hills?
Well, it was beautiful. Well, I just went to Google and went on images, and it looked really beautiful, like the landscapes and the water, and just the city landscape looked good.
Yeah. So you bring up a really interesting one because Banana Hills is very much recently has become like a popular tourist destination. It's the natural landscape is beautiful, but there's also a pretty developed resort that I want to go there. I haven't actually gone there, but there's a resort that's modeled off of a French understanding of, or modeled off of what we think of France. So then it looks a little bit like a Disneyland, but like in the countryside, in the hills of Banana. And yeah, so it's kind of this interesting space that it's like, oh, but then a lot of tourists go there now. Yeah, so for me, like I started searching and like trying to understand Vietnam, but then I realized it was really hard to understand, like kind of bridging out of the lessons that I learned in high school as well. Like it was very much either about the war or contemporarily today, it's about like tourism or maybe like Vietnamese food and recipes and things like that. So for me, this shaped my professional commitments to seek to diversify the body of knowledge about Vietnam. I started to study history and I started to really feel committed or be committed about teaching history and pursuing it and deeply researching it to think about how my knowledge and my skills could continue to further our understanding of Vietnam. So my academic journey, this is actually me and my family at my graduation. Because my parents had to drop out of school about middle school because of the war, they had to basically start working and feeding and helping out their siblings. They didn't finish middle school, and when they came to the United States, they took a few classes in community college, but really didn't get a chance to go to school. And for me, it was a really big deal for me to get the chance and privilege to go to school and learn and ask questions and even kind of develop and open up my worldview in a different way than my parents. So I've committed myself to spending a lot of time, like 4 years at undergrad, 2 years, took a master's, 6 years at Berkeley, and then during that time I lived for 2 years in Vietnam and France to do more research. And now I'm a postdoc fellow, which essentially is like, I teach classes, but I also do a lot of research at Brown University. I've been in school for a really long time, and I think because I guess I was kind of good at it, but then I was just like, why am I doing this? And so I really like this talk because it made me think, like, why am I doing this? And I spent a lot of time doing this, and it's not just about, I think it's really important to reflect upon why you do it, and I'm just really excited to share with you why I do what I do. So the topic today is contested histories of Indochina, but I'm kind of framing it as more like why study Indochina or why did I study Indochina? And the big takeaway I want to encourage you to think about why you do what you do. For me, like when people ask me, like, "Oh, tell me about colonialism," or "You know a lot about like 1930s to 1960s Saigon," I'm like, "Yeah, it's actually I do know a lot, but actually I do it not because it's interesting, because sometimes it feels really dry and boring and tiring, but it's because it's important." And I want to help like inspire a conversation about finding something that's important in your life and committing yourself to it. So my response to the question of why I do this, are 3 parts. It's important. I get to constantly learn and unlearn things that I thought were real, but really push me to challenge truth and to keep contributing to that truth. And then the third thing is that it's hard. It's really, doing historical research is really hard. Takes a lot of time, and I'll spend some time talking about that, but it's also like really confusing, and there's a lot of directions in which you can go. So first thing, it's important, and it's important for me personally to study Vietnam and to study colonial history, because that's part of Southeast Asian history, because that's where my family's from. But as I learned more and more about history, I also learned that it's also really the history and how it shapes contemporary politics and society and culture is really, really important to understand how the world works today, but also how these regions see themselves, so Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia see themselves and each other. So in other words, it's important because the colonial period really shaped a lot of the national boundaries and national identity of the 3 territories. So when I say the word Indochina, what am I talking about? What's kind of your background sense on this? Because it's not as common of a word anymore. What do I mean by the word Indochina? Yeah. Yes.
It's kind of the land between China and Indonesia.
Land between China and Indonesia? I think it's actually between India and, well, officially it is between Indonesia too, but the classification is between India and China. This territory between India and China. Yeah. Well, and then I think there was another hand up there. Yeah.
That it's made up of Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam.
Yeah, so another interpretation is that it's made up of the contemporary boundary nations of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. But actually, the historic definition of Indochina too also means kind of Southeast Asia, just this territory, the biggest territory between India and China, or sometimes it would even mean like Asia. So there's a lot of definitions of Indochina, but for me, and what I'm interested in is specifically, I'm studying, to your point, French colonial Indochina, so Vietnam, today Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And this territory reach, and this geopolitical entity, which was considered French colonial Indochina, was from 1887 to 1954. So just to place this a little bit better. So when we're thinking about space, so this is contemporary Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and this is within the countries of Southeast Asia. And geographically, Southeast Asia is kind of divided by patterns between mainland and insular. And one question that I often get is why was there Western imperialism in Southeast Asia? And it's a really hard question, but the underlying of it is that there are purely economic reasons. The French proposed that there were, and then pushed out a lot of essentially political propaganda that said they were doing like us, they were trying to bring civilization and bring modernity and bring technology. This was for the betterment of the rest of the world. But at the core of it, it was France was trying to compete with other European countries and create an empire that, and to spread its reaches throughout the rest of the world and basically extract resources to gain access to trade routes. Specifically for France, they basically, as you can see, the breakdown of other colonial territories in Southeast Asia, they were competing a lot with Britain, who had territorial control in the ports in China, as well as Burma and British Malaya. And they wanted to have a administrative, political, and economic base to trade with China, trade with India, and also to extract resources within these territories of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The conquest of this territory occurred in very piecemeal ways. So when we think about colonialism, one key takeaway point is to think about that it's extremely uneven. It creates systems of inequality between those who benefit from colonialism, usually through economic extraction, and those who basically are laboring for the economy or are pushed out because of different administrative transformations. And it's very uneven because it didn't French come and then all of a sudden this territory is empty, and they're living populations that are here, living authorities, living governments, living monarchies in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, pre-existing to the French. But I did want to point to the different territories that France had built up a lot of its colonial administrative bases, trade ports, and military bases. Is that a lot of it happened actually in the lowland areas. So first France had military battles and conquered territories of Saigon and expanded into Cambodia. This is primarily lowland areas where they had access to the waterways, but also through these areas, it was actually the most populous. So there was already a lot of local populations that were here, and then this is Hanoi here. I point to this observation to also think about contemporary repercussions of what this means. Is that these areas are more populous and have more concentration of lowland farming, so people are better fed there. There's more access to neighboring areas, and if we look at Indochina today, these are actually the biggest cities are here. So you have like Ho Chi Minh City down here. You have Phnom Penh and Siem Reap, and then Hanoi in the lowland areas. And this is to kind of show a little bit more of like how the landscape was transformed through colonialism, which was an extractive, exploitative process. So conquest really accompanied development of different types of industries. So mining industry, where there were a lot of forced labor of local populations. The plantation economy was very influential, very detrimental to both the landscape and the populations, particularly in the Mekong Delta region where you had a lot of rubber coconut plantations. And besides economy, there was also an attempt to create an administrative geography legible and that made sense to French understandings of space. So they tried to basically map and create these boundaries between these countries and French administration ruled these territories as discrete entities, but also part of France. So Tonkin, which is now northern Vietnam, central Vietnam, and then southern Vietnam, Cochinchina, so Cambodia, and then Laos were all ruled as separate entities, but were part of French colonial administration. So I point to this because this is roughly the geographic boundaries that are present today. And the tricky thing is that ethnicities, populations don't fall along these boundaries, right? There's extreme diversity within each country, but also especially in these border regions, which previously there was not a strict form of borders. So this is a map of the ethnic diversity in this, specifically this Cambodia, South Vietnamese region. And the other key point I want to think about why is colonialism important is because it influenced ethnic relations. So the colonial administration relied heavily upon the ethnic Viet majority population that were based in the lowland areas that I pointed to, and that's showed here in the green. And essentially, this means that there was an internal colonization that was happening. France, they didn't send thousands and thousands of French administrators to this faraway territory. They actually sent some and then relied upon local administrators, primarily Vietnamese. So they sent, so that means that Vietnamese administrators were sent into the highlands of Vietnam, also into Cambodia and Laos to operate and run the government, to collect taxes, to implement policy. And this really intensified the ethnic linguistic tension between these three countries. This also meant that in terms of infrastructural development, the territories that were the lowland Viet population areas had more infrastructure development, schools, hospitals, offices, light manufacturing, and roads, which meant more economic opportunities, which meant a higher standard of living and more, so I wanted to bring that point up because there's still today so much ethnic tension between, even within Vietnam, the highlands and the lowlands, and then especially in these border regions. So that's my takeaway point is that I want to shift the conversation a little bit to the next slide, which is not so much about conquest, but thinking about how was colonialism experienced and what did it mean for local populations. Because a lot of the history of studying colonialism is that it was bad, but then there were also good stuff. And that binary is actually really problematic because, one, it also presupposes that local populations don't know how to make sense of their own world in their own way. And I want to shift the lens to understand, not in this moralistic judgment if it's good or bad, but thinking about how do local populations experience and use these different tools of either communication or urbanization, something of social change to make sense of the world and also to contest and resist the government. So the second takeaway point of why I love studying about Indochina is that I'm still learning a lot. There's a lot to cover, and there's a lot to learn. And one of the things I love learning about is all these changes that were happening, because I really relate to it. I think about, these are this was 100 years ago, but I still see so many of these changes still impacting us today. So different forms of transportation, migration, building of cities. The 1920s to 40s was this period of tremendous change. And it essentially created these new forms of communication, new forms of identity, and really pulled people into new spaces and formed these new forms of community. So here's a few images of thinking about what that meant. So we have paved roads, an automobile, the transportation infrastructure, the same one that is still used today, the groundwork was laid out in the 30s. So if you look at this railway station map, where are the railways in this map? What's that? Along the water, along the coast, right? What about in terms of kind of country breakdown or territory? Where are they mainly? Because there's some right here. They're not all connected either. There's one that goes up here. Where are they connecting? Cambodia, major cities, is that what I was going to say? Yeah, and north to south, right? And a lot of this really cuts through mainly Vietnam. So a lot of the transportation the goal for the French was to connect China actually all the way through Vietnam. And this is the lowland areas where it's easier to build roads. So there was very little infrastructure development in other areas, but you also have it through Phnom Penh too. And this map is really striking because it also shows how different continents are connected too. So this is a tourist map catered towards French and European tourists who show the route if you were to go to Paris and Marseille by steamship or by airplane. And looking at this map, this really shows the map. What are the things that are represented in this map? If you're a tourist and you see this map, what are the visual things that kind of are
Cultures.
Sorry, say that again?
Culture.
Yeah, so there's different cultures, but how are the cultures represented?
Water.
What's that? I'm sorry.
Water, the ocean.
Yeah, so there's you have the ocean's really key and separates it. What else?
Economy.
Economy, and then there was something. Sorry.
Temple.
Temple, right? Yeah. Sorry, I realized
It's
this projection room is a little hard to hear. I know someone's speaking, but it's also, yeah. So a lot of temples, right? So culture is kind of characterized by temples and buildings, but also music, and there's some animals. It feels a bit Disneyland-like in a way. It feels okay, these cultures are on display, and you as a tourist can come and experience them. So there were a lot of these imagery that basically was trying to create culture in this digestible, economic, almost capitalist or consumerist way for French and European audiences, right? But of course, like culture on the ground is experienced very differently. So what did it look like? So cities, you also have like the experience like the first time on bicycles, and you have people being able to move back and forth. You also have like new transportation ways. And the thing is, there was also extensive destruction and pushing out of previous communities, right? Like as you build these roads and whatnot, these are previous people's family homes. And so in Hanoi, this is a really great book that I highly recommend. It's a graphic novel to understand the development of colonial Hanoi, as well as how different populations were basically pushed into one quarter they called the native quarter. And then while these areas were more of what you as the French quarters, more of what you see as like, you can see the roads are more straight, you'll have more development, like tramways and whatnot, but you'll also have access to better health and hygiene. And then in this territory, this graphic novel is interesting because it investigates the issue of hygiene, and because of the pure concentration of people forced to live in this area, how there were different forms of disease that spread because of this forced colonization and forced segregation that was happening. And then the other thing I wanted to point to was new forms of community. With all these changes in communications and transportation, people were trying to make sense of the world around them. And this was the cover that I had. What I love about this is these three women actually represent 3 territories of Vietnam, and they're all reading a magazine with their faces down here too. So it has this interesting kind of showcase of like we are understanding and reading about our people and our culture. And then there's also this ad here for, do you know what this is? This comes Nestle, right? So Nestle had a really big influence in the colonies, pushing out a lot of new types of food that were often showed as like, oh, it's good for moms to feed children Nestle condensed milk, because how to make sense of the world, new ideas took place on these magazines. And this is actually, I just love these examples. These are different debates. So like one would be like, these are advertisements for different type of clothing. So the definition of what it meant to be like female or beautiful was really an amalgamation of a lot of different social pressures and influence. Like you have the more French styled hair and makeup, but this is also like a hybrid form of a traditional Vietnamese outfit. So this is an ad for a new type of stylized outfit. And this really kind of showcases the kind of ambiguity or hesitance about what it means to like be urban or modern, right? So this is actually a caricature who he says, his name is Nguyen, and it says like, Nguyen is civilized. So he sees like, oh, it's trendy now to wear sweaters. How do I wear a sweater? So he's like trying to figure it out and say, oh, I put on a sweater correctly, now I am civilized. So he's kind of pushing and critiquing subtly all this French ads and discourse about, oh, the French are superior in this way and Vietnamese should be civilized, thus you must adopt these trends. But he's just like, these trends are kind of weird, but I guess it's so easy to be that. So he's doing this tongue-in-cheek type of criticism, and this is in a popular Vietnamese newspaper. And this one's both like a PR campaign and also a criticism of all the transportation transformations. So like it goes, oh, what a convenient road this is. Traveling this way, I no longer have to fear getting run over by an automobile. I'm no longer afraid of being killed in an automobile accident. And actually there's a lot of records during the 30s of people getting run over in automobile accidents, because people are moving really fast, streets are new, it's kind of bizarre to separate out pedestrians, but also those who had access to cars were generally French or Vietnamese elites, and those who were being run over were just people in the streets, children, vendors, and it really kind of showcased, it's a slightly class critique here too of who is getting run over and who are kind of the victims of these new, what seemingly looks like good economic development, but actually are kind of, it could viscerally destroy, like kill you if you get run over. So he's criticizing kind of these changes and what it means for the landscape of Vietnam. So I see a lot of these, this is where my research is, I see a lot of these types of print commentary amongst Vietnamese between each other as kind of like they're kind of akin to like BuzzFeed articles or YouTube how-to videos or little kind of tongue-in-cheek critiques of like, do you know those like electric scooters that have now taken off? Maybe not so much around here, but like people are like, get out of the road, or you shouldn't do, you know, like there's like opinions about how you should behave on these, but they're also like thrown everywhere. So there's kind of a lot of this. What I like to examine is thinking about how the public like engages and discusses like what it is that, how we should behave and how to be more safe and respectful to one another. So this is a bit of a summary of kind of the things that I was pointing to in terms of tremendous changes that keep me learning and understanding about what happened during French colonialism in Vietnam and Cambodia, but also what did it kind of look like on the ground. And there's a lot of tremendous transformations, but one point I want to emphasize is that there's the rearticulation of a lot of social, political, and economic inequity. So I pointed to before that administration was based off of an ethnic privileging of the Viet people over other populations, but there's also a class divide, an urban-rural population divide, where a lot of these technologies were really for the city, and a lot of the language and communication was about, wow, the city is where the modern people are, the civilized people are, and the countryside, we need to essentially change them, right? There's a lot of this discussion. So when I think about things that I'm learning about these transformations, I think about how these transformations create opportunities for some and disenfranchise others. And this theme helps me to think about contemporary, local, national, global politics too, is that things that, especially in development, is we think that like bringing certain forms of literacy or certain forms of transportation will help to connect people and create more economic opportunity, but how does it really manifest on the ground, and who is actually really getting helped? Why are we doing this? And that really pushes me to think critically today. So this is just kind of a slide of the tremendous inequity that was perpetuated through colonialism and actually carries today. So one thing I said was, remember I said there were a lot of automobiles, right? So often when there was also a lot of legal plurality. So if a French person was driving a car and hit a pedestrian who was Vietnamese, the French person would not get in trouble. But if it was the other way, the Vietnamese driver would get fined or would get put in jail. So essentially, it was the legal system was created to privilege and benefit really the French and the urban elites, but there was just so much inequity that was built into that. And during this time, with the rise of print and communities, we also had spaces for dissent, right? So the newspaper became also a space for people to talk about injustice, like why was it that French were getting off the hook, off committing the same crimes as Vietnamese, why it was that there were so many still Vietnamese forced labor plantations that were happening throughout the countryside, and there's like not access to water, but the French at the same time were building these beautiful buildings in the cities, purporting that the French were so great and so modern. So this is an example of a protest that broke out in 25-26 that a lot of Vietnamese youth saw these two events, the trial of Phan Bội Châu, who was an anti-French revolutionary who basically advocated and called out injustice and said the French are not honoring all the things that they claim in the country of France. They say that it's all about liberty, equality, and fraternity, but that wasn't actually being carried out in the colonies. And similarly, the funeral of Phan Chi Jin, who was a beloved person who actually advocated working with the French. He wasn't saying like push out the French, but he wanted to say, okay, let's create new forms of reform and improvement of language and building new schools to try to modernize and create new technology to increase access. But it was essentially this funeral and then the unfair trial of Phan Bội Châu that resulted in his house arrest that led to just a moment in time where thousands upon thousands of Vietnamese youth protested. They stood up in schools, they went to the streets, and a lot of these, it was kind of a culmination of a lot of anger of the unfair system that they were experiencing. Many of these individuals were actually put in forced labor camps and were arrested and put into very violent prisons. You have a photo of a very brutal form of imprisonment here. And then, like, the key thing I wanted to show is that there's so much complexity about learning about experience of colonialism, right? There's all these technological or transformative ways in which a landscape is being transformed, but many are actually really not benefiting or not, like there's real living repercussions on human lives. So I just want to, so I had until 3:15, right, just to check. Okay, good. So I want to slow down a little bit so we can spend more time thinking about what this means for history. Are there any questions first before we continue on? I know I went through a lot. I went through a lot about these territories. Yeah.
Is there a reason that like the railroad didn't go through Laos?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's two ways I can answer that. One is that it was Laos has the terrain is much more mountainous, so it's a lot harder to build railroads that way. Most of the infrastructural development and transportation in Laos was through roads, and it was to connect. But roads were difficult too because a lot of previous forms of movement of people before French colonialism was actually between Laos and Thailand, and then along the Mekong River, which goes from China, Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and parts of Vietnam. So there were other forms of transportation that were really relied upon by the local population. And the second reason for this is my point about that infrastructure development really prioritized and focused on the eastern side, Eastern Indochina, so that's the Vietnamese territory. And that's where they saw the focus to basically connect China and the coast, and then down to Saigon, which is where Saigon and the Mekong Delta region is seen as like the breadbasket. So a lot of rice is actually, I guess a rice basket would make more sense than a breadbasket, but a rice basket of Vietnam, because so much of rice is cultivated there. So a lot of it was like then shipped along up to the north and then exported as well. Good question. Any other questions before I continue on? I feel like I'm talking really fast.
Did you say there was still tension today?
Yeah, there is.
Is that just because of the past and everything that happened and went on? Okay.
Yeah, and the tension's complex because I argue that it has roots in the colonial period, but of course, from 1954, or from 1945 to 1954, the territory also engaged in a war of decolonization when France tried to reinvade and reconquer those territories. And then after that, there was also the Second Indochina War with the United States. And a lot of the ethnic tensions had its roots in the colonial period, because you can see that essentially there was a lot of upland, lowland tension between who was in power, the Vietnamese primarily, but also the lowland populations, and who had access to education, other forms of technology. So during the Second Indochina War, which is the war primarily between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, this is hard. So the Second Indochina War, which is also called the Vietnam War, there's two ways of framing it: the conflict between North and South Vietnam, or it's a conflict between US-backed South Vietnam and China, Soviet Union-backed North Vietnam, right? But it was also a conflict that involved Laos and Cambodia, because the US also bombed the territories that went, there were these roads that basically the northern troops would bring in ammunition and forces that went through Laos, that navigated a lot of these formerly colonial roads, went into Laos, and also it was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and it went all the way into Cambodia. So there's a lot of these tensions, and then populations don't, a lot of these border populations like moved between countries too. So a lot of the tensions in that. In Vietnam, in the case of Vietnam too, it's a majority versus ethnic minority issue too, is that almost I would say like 95% of those in government are majority Vietnamese, ethnic Vietnamese, while the rest of the population are ethnic minority groups who generally live in the lowland or the highland populations. Okay, good question. So the third thing is that I really love doing this type of work because it's really, really hard. Like, even as I was trying to answer this question, it's just like, okay, where do I start? There's so much history, there's so much that happened, and I know that every time I'm kind of answering, I feel like I'm kind of glossing over a lot of history. But that makes it interesting, right? And it makes me feel like I'm constantly learning. And what does it mean to do history? When I do history, often it's like the sources are limited, it's hard to find. I mentioned before that I spent 2 years living in Vietnam and France, going in the archives and basically searching through old documents, but a lot of them are kind of like not cataloged or falling apart. There's like insects eating through the documents or people have lost it. So I'm trying to find the documents, but I'm just like, there's so much I don't know. And then I request a document that says like what I think it is, but instead it's like empty or it's something totally random, right? And then the other side is that it's really hard because a lot of it's random, and that makes it fun and interesting. And I wanted to share a really fun or interesting thing that I had just found recently. One day I found this photograph in the archives, and this is essentially considered a primary source in historical research, which is a piece of evidence that originates from the historical context that you're examining. So through reading the document and seeing this caption, I found out that in December 1937, there was something called a bibliobus, which is a book wagon in Cochin, China, which is the southern territory of Vietnam, that was held, and it was in front of a central market in Cap St. Jacques, which is the southern area of Vietnam. So let's do a little bit of an activity so you can see what it is that I do as a historian. The first thing I do is I'm trying to understand what is this photograph. So can I have someone, a volunteer, that just like describes what's kind of going on in the photograph? What do they see? Kind of this first step. What's going on? Yeah.
I see a few soldiers on the left,
Mm-hmm.
and it looks like someone's sitting down on the far right. I'm not sure if they're doing a registry or something, doing some labor.
Mm-hmm.
But
So-
the soldiers for sure, that come on.
Right, and you know they're soldiers because of maybe,
Big guard.
yeah, maybe their hat and their clothes, right? And then someone sitting down in front. Any other details? Yeah.
It looks almost sort of like a food truck,
Hmm.
but once you read the caption, it's sort of like a library on wheels.
Right. Yeah, so it shows something about a library on wheels. Let's look at behind this a little bit. What's going on back here? Is everyone interested in this book wagon? Not really, right? There's some people in the back. It looks like, because I mentioned this was a market, so people are just continuing on laboring. So the second step is something interesting to think about is who is not in this photograph? Good. Right here.
Women?
Yeah, women, right? You don't see women, or do you really see children? Okay, so it seems like it was targeted primarily towards men, but it also reflects a lot about the literacy rates in both colonial Vietnam, but also globally, historically, is that primarily those who had access to school were men of middle to elite class. What else could, so maybe let's go to step 3. Why do you think this source was created? Or why do you think this photograph was taken?
I think it's to show the difference between the French and the local Vietnamese, like they kind of separated. So like the French are more interested like on those eliting the library and stuff, and the Vietnamese locals are like in the market and selling things, and they look into the cameras.
Right here, right? The two that are just looking. That's really interesting. Yeah, there's kind of a divide because this person looks like a Frenchman, actually. I can't really tell for the others. But you can tell that there's a division between those who are really interested in the bookmobile, and then the people who are just in the market, and then maybe these two characters who seem really actually stiff and posed almost. Why else would this photograph be taken, do you think? Yeah.
To promote French influence on Vietnam.
Yeah, so promote in what way?
To like, kind of like say this, we're making it more civilized, or like this is like a good place to be, and like we're making it better, so our influence is positive.
Right. In many ways, it shows like a benevolent or positive side of French colonialism, because you have a book wagon which looks quite developed, and it's bringing it into different areas, right? And it shows some form of a little bit like advertising or promotion of French colonialism. And so I read this, and I think it's really fascinating as part of my research, but then I was just like, still like, what is this? So often with historical work, you kind of have like one piece and you're just kind of like digging around to see the rest of it. So I read the rest of this photograph, or this photograph is printed in another document, and the document was essentially the official Libraries and Archives of Indochina report, which is a government report, and it showcases like each year how many libraries the French produce. And then now we have this special other project called the Bibliobus, where we take the books into the countryside, right? And then this document, which is primarily a textual document, explains how over time there's increased literacy or increased books and whatnot. And then I continue to dig deeper, because that's what historians do. It's like, okay, it's really interesting, but still, like, why was it interesting? Is it just, were the French only interested in creating a system to make them look good, right? Like, there must be something more complex than this. So I dug deeper, and then I found out like that folder actually had a bunch of other kind of reports or research material, where the head librarian, his name was Paul Boudet, who's a Frenchman. He'd been living in Vietnam and working there for 30 years already, and he really wanted to see different library systems throughout the world. So he actually studied a bunch of American public library systems. So this is in the 1890s, 1920s, where there's other similar projects that are trying to bring country reading into the countryside, increasing literacy and access to material, because a lot of like in Vietnam, a lot of the development, schools, was really focused on the cities, not the countryside. And then here's a catalog of the different kind of book wagons that one might use. So I'm like, okay, that's interesting, but is it important? And then my work as a historian is to make these claims at the end, right? It's like, why is this important? So for me, I make two major claims, is that colonial libraries in Indochina connected to international movements. And that's really important, because then libraries aren't just kind of understood within either it's an arm of the state or not, but it's something about the definition of public access and literacy and what the role of the government was. And then what I continued to research more was actually this project. Paul Boudet, the director of the libraries in Vietnam, was trying to sell the project to the governor to get more sponsorship and support, financial support. And he basically told him that we could create the system to basically provide pro-French propaganda. We could give all this reading that was not like explicitly pro-French, but it was seen as politically safe. So there would be a lot of children's tales, short stories, popular literature that was translated into French and also into Vietnamese at that time, such as Three Musketeers, the Count of Monte Cristo, Sherlock Holmes, so, English literature as well, Pearl S. Buck. So all these things were translated in and seen as safe reading, as seen as reading that would entertain people but not make them politically active. So then this is where my work gets kind of really interesting and complicated, because then it's like, oh, it's pushing me to unlearn this assumption that literacy and promotion of reading is always considered benevolent or good. There's something more complicated than that too. And this goes to the point about like why it is that I do research, and it's hard, because there's no simple answer to why kind of the French create these projects and if it's good or it's bad, but it's that I have to make a claim about it being important to understand something about the world that people are living in, but important to also understand Vietnamese history and how complicated the state relations and also forms of power manifest in different ways. It's not always like as explicit as like we're going to imprison everyone or we're going to conquer this area and force people into forced labor, but it's actually more subtle. right? We're going to permeate the market with certain types of literature. It's going to be funded as so it's more complicated. And I know that my argument as a historian is going to constantly change. So I basically but I still make it. I want to strive towards improvement and betterment of knowledge, even though I'm not 100% certain. So I know that some of you are doing like research projects and whatnot. So I encourage you to be brave in those statements, but also to recognize that this is a first attempt, and you can continue to be open to being challenged and changed for your future work. I want to have time for questions. So if there's more questions about my research, which is on the history of the libraries, I essentially look at libraries in the colonial period as like a proto-internet to see how people have access to ideas and how the government's involved, but also how people get empowered by new ideas, especially about gender and public space. And I want to reiterate the key things about why I do what I do. It's important, I'm constantly learning, and it's hard. I seek to continue to diversify knowledge about Vietnam, and for me, history is just one mode of doing that. I want to find ways to understand the world, to understand Vietnam, and I also do film, poetry, and storytelling too. So if you're free next Friday, I'm actually doing a talk at Harvard where I show my film. It's gonna be like an informal conversation, so please come. It's free lunch.
Free food.
So we're going to screen my short film, which is about 10 minutes, where I make it with a film I made with my mom, where we talk about language and how certain words. So this is a picture of us holding this up. This word is khan, which means difficulty. And it was just like a word that she always used growing up, but I never really translated it into English. I just knew that was like the word my mom always talked about. But as I grew up, I was just like, wait, this is like a very specific word to be growing up with. And what does that mean? How do I translate it? And how do I understand her and her history through these words? And for me, being both a historian and an artist really helps me to become more compassionate and understand others. Like in my research work, in my memory work, in my film work, I'm constantly trying to push myself to understand why was the world, like understand different contexts, understand how something came to be. So when we did that exercise to examine this weird, interesting bibliobust source, we were thinking about why was that created, who was it for, why does it matter? And then the second thing about being a historian and artist that's really exciting is that I'm recognizing that things change and that I might make a statement, I might make a claim, I might try to understand the world a certain way, but over time I'm going to keep trying to learn. I hope that like in the future one of you can also basically undermine all of my research too and create better research to basically challenge what I say, because that's what makes history and knowledge production great. Thank you very much. This is my academic website and my artist website and my email. Please feel free to reach out. We'll have some time for questions, so thank you again for listening.
We have time for about 5 or 6 questions, for about 5 or 6 minutes. So if you've got a question, ask it now.
Yes.
Let's say I was interested in learning more. Is there like a video series or something that could be easy to digest and make it easy to digest? Like, you know what I mean? Like easy to like watch and learn stuff and be entertained. Like those videos of like the hand-drawn stuff. I'm being serious, guys.
No, yeah, that's a good question. So history is about Vietnam or just history in general?
Yeah, about Vietnamese history and the history of the South.
Yes, and Southeast Asia. So that, I would say that graphic novel that I pointed to,
Yeah,
The Great Hanoi Rat Hut. That's one because it's graphic. It's like really, I've only recently read it, and I wish I read it when I first started studying this, because I would be able to connect with more of the emotional and physical manifestations of colonialism, like thinking about how certain streets are designated for French versus for Vietnamese, things like that. So I think that graphic novel is really good. I also think there's a few. Even though I'm a historian, I'm also a proponent of YouTube too. Like there are some interesting visual representations of how people talk about history. That being said, kind of connected to the first question I had, which is like when you Google Vietnam, like what do you get? There's also a lot of like really kind of trash material about Vietnam where it's like, here are like 3 different pho restaurants you can eat. And it's like, I didn't learn anything about Vietnam. You know, it's like, that's for a certain time. But I think it's hard sometimes to always just rely upon Google. I mean, I would direct you to my website too, because I actually curate a lot of different types of reading lists, books. I want to make a new list on literature too, because that's something that I've been thinking about, on how to understand history through arts and literature. There's
Crash course videos are actually,
they're
only 10 minutes long.
crash course videos. There's also this beautiful, if you search Nam Le's NAM space LE, The Boat, it was also it was a story turned into a graphic video series. And I'm like, maybe I
Why don't
should
you
type
Google it
it.
real quick?
Can you see it if I should?
Yeah.
I think it's blank.
No, just
Can you see it?
yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah, it's the website, right?
Yeah. SBS. So now I'm the boat. It's an interactive. Okay, so I watched this and I cried. I was just. I don't think you can really hear it. But this is. Have you used this in your classes? This is really, and it's like it's a visual book.